Ah, there we go. All right. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. We're live and in person. It's Tuesday afternoon. Yeah. Okay, we're going to start today with a briefing on the evaluation of the Minority Business Enterprise Program. And we have with us Michael Powell from the Office of Program Evaluation, Government Accountability Director, DLS, and Michael Rubenstein, Principal Policy Analysis at DLS. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Gazzoni, Vice Chairman Rosapep, and committee members. Thanks for having us today. My name is Mike Powell. I'm the Director of the Office of Program Evaluation and Government Accountability at the Department of Legislative Services. And last month, we published an evaluation of the state's Minority Business Enterprise, or MBE, program. As many of you already know, the state has a goal that 29% of contract award dollars go to MBEs. This is the second highest goal of any state after New York at 30%. Maryland came closest to achieving that goal in fiscal 2014 and 15, achieving 27 and 26% respectively. However, MBE participation has dipped to 14% in fiscal 2020, less than half of the state's goal. While that year was somewhat impacted by COVID-19 procurements, the previous 2 years had MBE participation of 15 and 18% respectively. It's important to understand what participation means. Participation is the amount of a contract that should go to an MBE as written in a solicitation and presumably the contract itself. One of the things our evaluation found was that only 5% of contracts have an MBE participation of 29% or more. Additionally, participation does not mean the percentage of contract dollars that are actually paid to MBEs. Payments can change for a variety of reasons. We found that 46% of contracts actually make less than the expected payment to MBEs. So for example, a $1 million contract with 20% MBE participation, or $200,000, may end up paying MBEs only $150,000. Still, in that case, MBE participation would be reported at 20%, even though payments were only 15% of the total contract value. Our evaluation has a number of recommendations for improving the effectiveness of the program. And we have hard copies, I think, for anybody who would want them. And with that, let me turn it over to Michael Rubenstein from the Office of Policy Analysis, who led the evaluation team.
Thank you, Mike. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman, members of the committee, Michael Rubenstein with the Department of Legislative Services to talk about the MBE evaluation. I just want to start out with a couple recognitions. The first is we do want to extend our gratitude to the 4 agencies in particular that we worked closest with on this evaluation. Board of Public Works, Department of General Services, Department of Transportation, and the Governor's Office of Small Minority and Business Affairs. We got a lot of information from them, a lot of data that they provided to us. We couldn't have done this without them, and we're very grateful for their cooperation and their expertise. I also want to recognize the members of the team that worked on this report. This was a joint effort between the OPEGA, the new office, and the Office of Policy Analysis. From OPEGA, we had Tanya Webb and Diana Winter. And from OPA, we had Lindsay Rowe and April Morton, as well as myself. So with that, I do want to talk about the history of the program. I do want to say part of my goal in doing this evaluation was to provide what I hope to be a comprehensive and fairly authoritative summary of the program. It's hard to find. It's a very complicated program. It started out in 1978 with 5 agencies and a goal of 10%. It's now 70 agencies and a goal of 29%. A lot has changed in the meantime. And so if this program is of interest to you, I would recommend that you look at Chapter 2 of the report. There's an extensive summary of the program, all the various aspects of it. It's about 10 pages. Shouldn't take you too long. As I said, the program was established in 1978. It's been reauthorized multiple times since then, last in 2017. It is scheduled to terminate July 1st of this year. There is a bill in to renew that. I think it's already actually made it to the floor. There was supposed to be a disparity study that completed in September of last year. That was not done. The MDOT just awarded the contract for that in December. And so they anticipate it'll take about 2 years. The renewal is for 2 years in that bill. The participation goal, as Mike mentioned, is 29%, the second highest in the country. That was initially established in 2013. It is renewed and reviewed every 2 years. They have kept it at 29% since then. The program administration and oversight is really scattered amongst various state agencies. You have the Maryland Department of Transportation that certifies MBEs. We currently have about 7,200 of them. The Governor's Office of Small Minority and Women Business Affairs, GOSBA, establishes a statewide goal and program policies, as well as conducts outreach and reports the performance of the program in annual reports. And the procurement units throughout the state, all 70 of them, establish the MBE participation goals for each contract, and they are responsible for tracking vendor compliance. So why do we do the evaluation? This graph pretty much summarizes the 2 reasons. The first is, as you can see, the MBE participation goal rate has declined as reported over the last 5 or 6 years. COVID obviously had an impact last year because there were a lot of emergency procurements, and emergency procurements don't require an MBE goal. But as Mike mentioned, even the few years before that, the goal was already down a ways. You can see the big drop in 2016. That was largely due to a change in the definition of MBEs. It removed the nonprofit organizations from the definition of MBEs, and that caused the participation rate to drop somewhat. So the first thing we want to look at is what can we do to help increase MBE participation. The second thing this chart is about, as Mike mentioned, is it only shows contract awards. We don't know anything about what happens after the contract is awarded. We don't know what payments look like to MBEs. And so part of the goal of this evaluation was to look at what happens after the contract is awarded. What is the experience of MBEs? How much do they actually get paid? And that is the second reason that we did the report. These are the major research questions. We want to look at the process for establishing the statewide MBE goal. There's not a lot known about how that process works. It's not publicized. The second thing is, what are the major barriers to MBE participation in state procurement? How can we get more MBEs involved? Third thing is, how do we set the MBE contract goals for each contract? That happens at the agency level. We want to know if those goals adequately reflect the availability of MBEs in the marketplace, and are they met by the prime contractors? And finally, because we've heard a lot of stories from MBEs over the years about their experience with the MBE program, we just wanted to get a sense of what the overall experience with the program is from their perspective. We got survey responses, a total of 2,700 from vendors in the state. That was evenly divided roughly between MBEs and non-MBEs. We didn't plan that, but it's just the way it worked out. We looked at contract payments for more than 3,000 completed contracts that ended between 2015 and 2020. We only wanted to look at completed ones, obviously, to see what the final payments look like. We did interviews with senior agency personnel throughout state government, procurement staff, and MBE stakeholders. We did focus groups with MBE owners, and we did an extensive review of relevant documents, reports, and legislative history. Turning to our key findings. The first one, as Mike mentioned, 95% of contract goals were lower than the statewide goal. Now, this is allowable. It's actually expected to some extent. It's just the extent to which we found it to be lower than the contract goal. The statewide goal was a bit surprising because there are various types of contracts. Each one has different types of available MBEs. You know, not every contract is going to have a goal of at least 29%. They're actually not supposed to. But we did expect a higher percentage to at least be at or around 29%, and we found that only 5% were at that level. Now, in terms of goals by type of industry, we only had this data from MDOT. We didn't have it for other state contracts. But in terms of what MDOT told us, you can see that for, depending on what type of contract it is, all the goals were generally below the availability of MBEs as reported by the disparity study. Some are closer than others, especially in, the architectural engineering and other construction-related services, it's fairly high. For services, it's fairly low. And this is one of the key findings here, which is that only 54% of the contracts met their payment obligations to MBEs at the end of the contract. And the standard here is what is the percentage participation that they initially started with. So as Mike said, if you have $1 million contract with a 10% goal, you would expect that MBE to be paid $100,000. If the actual payment ends up being $900,000, you still expect them to get $90,000 to meet that 10% goal. So that 10% goal becomes the standard, and only 54% of the contracts met whatever the contract goal was for their contract. Here you see larger contracts were less likely to have MBE primes and had lower payments to MBEs. If you look at the far left, for smaller contracts, the MBE participation was actually quite high for smaller contracts, and also the payments to MBEs are actually quite high. All the way on the far right, for contracts over $5 million, you can see the MBE participation and the number of contracts they get is actually much lower. And again, that's not terribly surprising. We did hear from MBEs along the way that they can't bid on large contracts, and that's one of their complaints about the program, is that they can't be prime contracts on large contracts because they don't have the capacity to work statewide. They tend to be fairly locally focused, and so it's not too surprising, but it is encouraging that they do fairly well when the contracts are small. In terms of what MBEs told us in terms of how to improve participation, one of the things, the thing they want most is opportunities to build on more prime contracts, smaller contracts. They want those contracts broken up. They want more opportunities to bid as primes, and they just don't see enough opportunities in the state procurement to do that. And they also indicated that from their perspective, prime contractors tend to work with the same MBEs over and over again, which makes it hard for them to break into the program. So turning to our recommendations, and I'm going to walk through these and talk about each one, and then I'll come back and have some observations based on some of the comments we got from the agencies in response. The first one is to codify an existing executive order that essentially requires small businesses small contracts to be set aside for small businesses. Those are between $50,000 and $500,000. That executive order was signed in January of last year, 2021. It's still in effect. We think it should be codified. A lot of MBEs are small businesses. They're not necessarily registered as small businesses, but they are small businesses, and we think having that set aside for them would be beneficial. You can't really do a set-aside program within the context of the MBE program. That's considered reverse discrimination. So you have to do it in the context of small businesses in general, but they will benefit substantially from that opportunity. We do ask agencies to give due consideration to breaking up the larger contracts. This actually already is in statute. We just wanted to emphasize that it is a priority from the perspective of MBEs to have more opportunities. And we ask them to consider piloting a requirement or a preference for joint ventures. Joint venture is a little different than an MBE contract. This is where an MBE and a non-MBE come together and they join as a joint venture and bid on the contract together. And that makes the MBE have a contractual relationship with the state, which they don't currently have under the MBE program. If they're a subcontractor, their relationship is with the prime contractor. They have no avenue to the state in terms of contractual relationship. Under a joint venture, they would have that, and we think that would increase participation and their and compliance. We think GOSBA should consider expanding the criteria for graduation to create opportunities for new MBEs. This came from some data that we looked at. There are, like I said, there are 7,200 certified MBEs. Even with a number that large, the number of graduated MBEs is under 30. So there's not much churn in the program. There's not people sort of graduating out and making room for new MBEs coming in. And that's what makes it harder for new MBEs to really break through and participate in state procurement. The current graduation requirements are set in regulation, and they basically relate to the size of the company. We think maybe an alternative or an additional criteria, not an alternative, but an additional criteria might be participation in state procurement. So once you reach a certain threshold in terms of dollars paid to you by the state over the course of your life, or a number of contracts that you get from the state, once you hit that threshold, you sort of move on and become more independent and make room for newer MBEs coming in. In terms of accountability, there is a requirement in current law that at the end of a contract, the agency has to do a compliance assessment to make sure that the MBEs were paid what they were supposed to be paid. We asked agencies what happens to that compliance assessment, and they basically said they put it in the file and nobody ever sees it. So we're asking that the results of those compliance assessments be reported to GOSBA, and GOSBA include them in their annual report for MBEs to talk about what actually happens after the contract is finished. We think GOSBA should develop and maintain a list of prime contractors that, absent mitigating circumstances, persistently fail to meet the MBE contract goals. And this is something, again, we heard from MBEs who said, you know what, and actually we heard this from agencies too. We know the contractors who don't fulfill their obligations, and yet they keep getting state contracts. So with this list, the agencies would have an opportunity to look and see, well, you know, such and such a contractor isn't meeting their obligations on a regular basis. We shouldn't give them a contract. We shouldn't deem them responsible for participating in state procurement. This is actually something that GOSBA, in a recent JCR report from a little over a year ago, said would be a good idea. And again, we think the past failure to consistently meet the MBE goal should be considered in making future awards. And then finally, we think the authority to assess liquidated damages against prime contractors that don't meet the terms of the MBE program should be repealed. This sounds a little counterintuitive, but in fact, what happened is we talked to the agencies and we asked them, do you assess these liquidated damage? When is the last time you assessed them? And they couldn't remember. None of the people we talked to could even recall a single instance in which liquidated damage was assessed. And their attitude is, you know, we don't want to antagonize the vendor community. We don't want to assess these damages, even if we know they're not meeting the terms of the MBE program. And so it's not used, so we recommend repealing that authority. In terms of support for MBEs, we recommend creating an MBE ombudsman within GOSBA to help resolve disputes between MBEs and prime contractors. This gets to the issue I raised earlier, which is MBEs don't have a contractual relationship with the state. And so when they have an issue with their prime contractor, I'm not getting paid, or they're not using me as much as they should, they have nowhere to go. And we heard this from a number of MBEs, including some who are very well connected in the state, who said basically they came across this situation with their prime contractors. They didn't feel they had anywhere to go. We want to give them an office where they can go and have some authority to help resolve these disputes. We want to allow the state to withhold payments to prime contractors that don't pay their subcontractors in a timely fashion to all contracts. Currently, that authority exists only for construction contracts. We think it should be included for all contracts. We think GOSBA should have more meet and greet opportunities for MBEs to connect with prime contractors. This is, again, something we heard from the MBEs that we talked to and in the surveys. They want more opportunities to basically pitch their business to the prime contractors because they have trouble sort of making that connection and breaking in. And we want to create an incentive for MBEs who are in that graduated status to mentor new MBEs. And this goes with the other recommendation we had about the graduation program, where if you're about to be graduated out of the program for any reason, but you want to stay in and get that benefit of being a certified MBE, if you agree to mentor a newer MBE, you can keep that status for a certain amount of time. And I'll come back to this in a little bit because this is an issue that was raised by MDOT in their response. But this is something that we heard from GOSBA, where they said there actually was legislation last year to require GOSBA to have a mentorship program for MBEs. And what they said in their JCR report is they've tried on a number of occasions in the past, and all those efforts have failed because they can't come up with an incentive to have veteran MBEs mentor younger MBEs. So we thought we'd give them this opportunity to create that incentive. In terms of transparency, we recommend having statewide MBE participation goals by industry type, not just the overall 29%, but do it by industry type. And that's because what we heard from agencies is, if the participation rate for construction, for instance, is about 34%, but you go down to services, it's about 13%. You go down to commodities, it's about 7%. So if you're an agency that does mostly commodities and services, you're not going to get to that 29%. Yet that's the standard they're being held to. And so we're saying, let's set the goals by industry type and then hold the agencies accountable for meeting those different goals rather than just the overall goal. We asked GOSBA to make their goal-setting methodology available to the public on its website. As I said, it's not currently available. We had to ask for how they set the goal originally, and they provided us with some information from their 2012 initial look, but there's nothing available since then. And we think each solicitation should document what the factors are that are used to determine the MBE participation goal for that procurement. This is something we heard from the MBEs who said, we get a solicitation and it says the MBE goal is 20%. We don't know how they got there. We don't know what the factors are. We don't know where we should be looking for subcontractors. We don't know what areas we should look at. So, to the extent that they can provide that information in the solicitation, the MBEs will have, or the primes will have more knowledge about where they should look. Couple technology recommendations. We think the state should prioritize the full upgrade of their financial management information system. This system dates back to the early 1990s. It's very old technology. It's very difficult to use. There is an effort underway that has started, but it's still in the infancy stage. It will take a number of years. This will help not only the MBE program in terms of reporting and accountability. MDOT upgraded their financial management system. Theirs is separate from the rest of the state. And now they're able to incorporate the MBE accountability into their financial management system that FEMA's can't do. And so, when we talked to DGS, they said, yeah, we're aware of what MDOT is doing. We would like to be able to do the same thing. We can't with the system we have. We think this should be a priority. It will help other things too, but it will also help the MBE program. And finally, we did talk to MDOT, and we found out that actually they were in the process, or they had started to develop an automated contract goal setting program that basically for each contract an agency could plug in certain numbers and it would spit out sort of a recommended goal for that contract. And a lot of the agencies we talked to said they liked that idea, they wanted to be able to use it. MDOT said they never really finished the program. They only use it for their P3 projects. They're not confident in sharing it with other agencies because it's not finished yet, and they ran out of money before they could finish it. We think it should be a priority to try to finish that program so that other agencies can use it. And then in terms of just finally some unresolved issues, we had a certain scope to this study. There were certain things that came up in the course of the study that we really couldn't resolve because it was outside the scope of the study. The first is we did hear from MBEs the allegations that there are sort of these MBE fronts or middlemen, that basically some of the larger prime contractors will set up an MBE that is basically a pass-through to the prime contractor. We can't confirm that. We're not investigators. We're not auditors. We don't, we couldn't go out and confirm this. We did hear it a number of times, but that's just something that is beyond the scope of this study. The second issue is bonding. Again, this is something that really extends beyond just the MBE program. We have heard over the years complaints from some vendors that bonding requirements for state procurement are very high and difficult for MBEs to meet. We asked MBEs about this and whether it's a barrier to their participation, and we got mixed results. Some said yes it is, others said not really. So based on that, we're not making any recommendations about bonding, plus the fact that it's really a much larger issue than just the MBE program because it gets at the whole state procurement and insurance. But that may be something to be looked at going forward. And the last thing is the timing of the submission of the MBE schedules. The current law is if you are a vendor and you are bidding on a state contract, you have to submit with your proposal or your bid the list of MBEs that you're going to use and how much of the contract they're going to get at the time you submit your bid. It used to be you had 10 days until after the contract award to do that. They moved that back because there was a lot of baiting and switching going on where vendors would come in and say, I'm going to use this company, and then they get the contract, no, I'm not really going to use that company, I'm going to use this company, or I'm not going to do that at all. So they moved it up, and they said, no, you have to submit that with your bid or your proposal. What that does is it encourages overpromising, and that may be one of the reasons why a lot of these vendors can't meet their MBE goals because they overpromise in their bid or their proposal. We just didn't have a better answer for that. If you move it back 10 days like it used to be, you run into the same problems you used to have. I don't know there's a good answer. We looked at different options and just didn't think there was anything better than the current proposal. So in terms of a couple of the recommendations we had, so the setting of the industry type. This is a concern that the AG's office and MDOT raised in some communication with us, and said basically if you set goals by industry type, you will have some unintended consequences where possibly some groups would be excluded from bidding on certain types of contracts. We're sensitive to that, and so one option might be just to recast that as having the reporting be done by industry type, not the goal setting. And that would avoid the issues that they're raising in terms of problems with goal setting, and just have it reported by industry type, and that would still get at what we're trying to accomplish. And then also, they raise concerns about this graduation approach. And what they say is, if you allow firms that are hitting that graduation criteria to stay in the program, that may raise some constitutional issues because you're letting firms be MBEs who shouldn't otherwise be MBEs. And again, we're sensitive to that. And, the issue of size is kind of interesting because if you look at the statute, size is not a criteria to be an MBE. You don't have to be a small business according to the MBE criterion statute. Where that size comes into play is in the regulations for the graduation program. And what it says is if you hit a certain size threshold, you graduate out of the program. So, again, we're sensitive to that. So what we're recommending is that GOSBA develop maybe some other criteria that are not related to size, but more to participation in state procurement. And we could change the recommendation or change the language in the bill to basically say if you meet that criteria, you can have an incentive to stay on as a mentor, but not the size criteria. And that would take care of that issue, I think. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Senator Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for this very in-depth report. I have a quick question for you. You spoke of a list of those who do not meet the criteria. So where did you find, or did you find, what happened to that list? Once it was...
Oh, no, there is no, we're recommending that there be a list. There is no list.
Got you. Got you. So when they haven't met the criteria, there is no punitive measures that are in place.
No, the statute has two options that are available to the agency in the case where a vendor does not meet their MBE obligation. The first is they can cancel the contract. Agencies don't want to do that. They're relying on that work to be done. They don't want to cancel the contract and have to rebid it and start all over. So that doesn't happen. Second thing they can do is assess the liquidated damages. Well, as I said, they don't do that either. They don't want to antagonize the vendor community. So those are two things they have available to them. They're not using them for obvious reasons. And, we're not necessarily critical of that. I think, we can understand why they don't use them. But the fact is there's really nothing else available to hold firms accountable for meeting the MBE goal so we're recommending this list.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Roosevelt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for a terrific report. I mean, very, very interesting. As I was thinking about this, I was thinking about, I wonder what the problems are in the program, and like you addressed all the things that I could think of and many more. So I really applaud this. It's a great study. The thing I wanted to focus in on was, you said for commodities, that has one of the lowest percentages. And here I just don't know how the system works. For the purpose of this program, do you have to be the manufacturer of the commodity and not a wholesaler of the commodity?
Correct. You actually get a lower MBE allowance if you are a distributor, not a manufacturer. So you only get 60% of the credit for your participation in the contract if you're just a distributor, not a manufacturer.
But wholesalers can qualify.
They can qualify. They get a lower MBE participation rate.
But they're counted among the low percentage on commodities?
Yes.
And this is just a question because you looked into it and I haven't. I mean, it would seem to me that should be a great place of opportunity. I mean, sourcing things is like a real skill and a real business. And I'm a little surprised that hadn't been an area of greater opportunity. Do you guys have any insight into that?
You can get rid of the 60%, just, give them full credit for their participation. But I think, they're trying to give credit to MBEs that are actually producing and manufacturing. And so I think that's why that was put in there. But, that would be one option, is to get rid of that 60%.
Okay, well, I raised that because I learned a lot about sourcing stuff during the COVID crisis, as did Mr. Powell. And sourcing vaccines, sourcing tests, sourcing PPE was like a real high-value add, and it was very difficult for the state and local governments to do it. It just strikes me that that's an area that is relatively low capital intensity but it takes real skill.
Yeah.
And might be an area that we could try to increase participation. So I just throw that out. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I want to, it's kind of a follow-on to this, but it's more about sort of the overall math of all this, because I'm struggling with that a little bit. And I'm wondering, you just mentioned the 60% criteria, and thinking about the overall 29% and how we're one of the highest in the nation and such. Are all of these the big picture numbers as well as the small pictures that go into all of this? Are they standardized across the country in any way, shape, or form? No.
No.
That's what I thought.
No, I mean.
So how do you even, how can you even really make a judgment? I mean, let me go back to is the big number, is the 29%, is that standardized in any way?
Yes and no. I mean, there are only a small number of states that have just an MBE program. We talk about in the report, Virginia, for instance, has a joint MBE small business program, but their goal is, I think, 42%. But that's combining the small business with the MBE. And so one of the things we talked about was maybe we want to study that as an option because a number of states have a similar kind of program. That would have an implications to the MBE, no doubt. And I think MDOT raised that and GOSBA raised that in some of their responses. No question that would have an impact on the MBE community. We're not recommending that be done. We're just recommending it be studied as an option because it would allow some flexibility. It would allow potentially a higher goal, but it would also incorporate all small businesses, not just MBEs. But it's something maybe to be looked at. But there are only a small number of states that have just the strict MBE program. And those percentages tend to be around 10%, so we're fairly high. It's just New York has 30.
But that percentage, again, that 29 isn't necessarily the dollar value, right, of each, of the overall work of the state, right?
It's 29% of the contract awards is the goal. So depending on what the value of the contract is at the time of award, it would be 29% of that is the goal.
It is of that?
Yep.
Okay. Senator McCray.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Rubenstein. Couple questions. One of them is, when you define agency, are you looking at quasi-agencies too, i.e. like MSA, service centers, and things of that nature?
We're looking at the 70 that are covered under the statute under this, and some of those that you mentioned are covered, some are not. I believe MSA is covered. I'd have to confirm that, but I'm not sure. But it varies depending on whether they're covered or not, and it specifies in the statute whether they're covered or not. Most of them are.
Okay, and I asked that question because the quasi-agencies, obviously, they got a significant more flexibility than the traditional agencies, so I'm curious how they perform in reference to that 29% goal from that standpoint. I guess I'll ask you that question offline if you haven't deciphered from that.
There's nothing consistent. I mean, the procurement statute exempts a number of entities from the procurement law, but then it brings back in a certain number of agencies or quasi-agencies into the MBE program by specifying, no, you're subject to this, but not the rest of the law. It's just, you have to look and see for each agency whether they're covered or not.
And my next question is, we had a very robust discussion in reference to just being paid on time, so I didn't see that as one of the barriers, or not that is from a barrier, but I didn't see it in your findings. So like, I know that if I wasn't going to be paid on time, or if I had a bad history with a respective of a person, that probably prohibited me. So can you tell me if you all touched on that a little bit, or what did you find out from that?
Yeah, that's a difficult issue. We did touch on it. In the survey, we did ask in terms of their experience about being paid on time, and 20% of the MBEs said that payments from the prime contractors are either never or almost never paid on time. So on the one hand, you can say, well, that's only 20%. On the other hand, you can say, if they're saying that the payments are never on time, that's a pretty bad idea. So the issue, and again, this gets back to FEMAS. Our financial management system is not really set up to be quick. It's, as I said, it's very old technology. A lot of the invoicing and so forth is still done on paper. or submissions, on paper. And the process of verifying the invoices and paying it can be very slow in that regard. On top of it, I think when I did a briefing here a few weeks ago on procurement, and I got the question about procurement staff, and I went back and looked and got some data from DBM and MDOT. Amongst our procurement staff, we have vacancy rates of 20%. And so there's just not enough people to process those invoices. And so you put that together with the old tech. Now, I have heard, I've talked to Champ McCulloch, he's testified a number of times on this issue. He said DGS is actually pretty good about paying on time. It's just some of the other agencies don't always do it. So, and he said some local governments aren't very good, but that's not in our control. In terms of a solution, I think, we might have to wait until that FEMA's upgrade is made so that we can start processing invoices electronically, which we don't do. So we can start, managing that whole process more efficiently and electronically with the technology, because right now it's very old and we don't have people around to do it.
I got it. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Rubenstein.
Senator Griffith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you. I want to agree with my colleagues. Thank you so much for this comprehensive report. It's, as I think my colleague from Prince George's County said, it's a lot of what we've been hearing over the years, but presented in a way that we can kind of refer back to it. So it's very helpful. I guess one of the things that I have heard a lot, and a part of it I think you spoke to in your chapter dealing with the experience of MBEs. But one of the things that I've heard from prime contractors is that the paperwork is so onerous when trying to meet the MBE goals. So I wondered if you all got any of that kind of feedback from your non-MBE respondents. And then also curious, and I'll keep it brief, Mr. Chairman, because, I could go all day and I know we have some other business ahead, but would love to talk about what needs to be involved in order to do some of the breaking up of the larger contracts in order to allow more MBEs to become primes. So those would be my two.
In terms of your first question, we close out the report with the comments from the non-MBE prime contractors, 50% of whom say they think the MBE program discourages participation by prime contractors in state procurement. So, yes, to the extent that we can reduce the amount of paperwork, make the whole procurement and invoicing experience more streamlined, I think that will help. To the extent we can incorporate some of this MBE accountability into the financial management system the way that MDOT has done. The good news is the new chief procurement officer came over from MDOT. He did some of this stuff over at MDOT. Hopefully, we've upgraded e-Maryland Marketplace already. We need to do the same with FEMAS and get them talking to each other. And I think that will take care of some of that issue, because the issue goes really beyond just the MB program. It goes to the whole state procurement experience and how antiquated some of it can be.
Senator Edwards.
I think some of the things you're recommending here are good. Out in our neck of the woods, we don't have a lot of large contractors. And when we do get a contract from a local one, and you have to have MBE, it's very tough for them to get them because you don't have a lot of MBEs in Western Maryland, from Washington County West. And I can remember a couple times companies coming to me and say they try to get the number, whether it's 29% or whatever the point is at that percentage at that time. You want to keep this in Maryland, you want to use Maryland contractors, so they try to get people down east where most of them are, which is the metropolitan area. But when you're in good economic times and they're busy, they'll tell you we can't send anybody up there, we can't sign up with you, or the price goes up. And a lot of times, our people then have to go to Morgantown, West Virginia area, or Pittsburgh and Uniontown, Pennsylvania areas to get subcontractors, and even in some cases to get the contractors to come in and build, and hiring our people as subcontractors. So hopefully, as you or whomever continue to look at this, you take those things into consideration. That I know in one case, I'll mention who it was. They tried and they tried, and they kept sending in, and the department kept saying, keep trying. well, we're trying, we're busting our buns, you can't get anybody, so what do? You know, not asking for anything, more than anybody else, but from those areas, and I'm sure maybe you have some same situation on the shore, we don't have as many contractors,
Right.
you need to kind of look at maybe a different percent. Not that you want to do that, but you got to be fair across the board of how you can hire these businesses. So I think some of the things you have on here would go a long way in helping to do some of that.
No, I think
Thank you, Mr.
you raised some important points, and I think what's important to understand is the distinction between the statewide goal and the contract goals. And the processes for those are very different, and the criteria for them are very different. Yes, there is a statewide goal of 29%. Obviously, that's sort of a goal, and it's sort of an average. So you expect some contracts to be higher, some contracts to be lower, and that's what we were showing earlier, that we thought more contracts would be higher than 29%, but we didn't find very many. But the process for setting the contract goal, and we did a deep dive on this in the report and in talking to the agencies, it's very deliberate, and one of the key things they're looking at is the availability of MBEs, and they look at it regionally. And so if a contract is for the Western Maryland region, they will look at, the availability of MBEs in that region, and they will use that to determine what the goal for that contract is going to be. Now, do they always get it right? Probably not, but it's at least considered in the process, and it's the big factor that is considered in that process. So, I hear you, and we definitely hear that from the primes and the MBEs. We definitely heard, and getting back to Senator Griffith's question about how do you break up these contracts, one of the things we talk about is if a contract is a statewide contract, you can break it up by region, and so then you can get more MBEs to bid on the smaller pieces of that contract as prime contractors. And that is done to some extent. I've seen it in the Board of Public Works agendas. We're just thinking maybe it could be done more often.
Senator Jackson, and then we're going to have to wrap it up.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, terrific presentation. Just a couple of quick questions. So when the MBEs have concerns, Senator McCray brought up the issue of those who were on the list or may not be on the list. And so if an MBE has an issue with getting paid, the ombudsman recommendation makes sense. But how much of that would be able to be covered if those folks are not on the list? So I think as we look forward, is that something that we would need to delve into? How we would, or would that?
The ombudsman would be available to anybody.
Okay.
So if you're an MBE and you have a dispute, we heard about, there's a provision in the statute that says if you graduate, you still get to stay on the contract that you're in,
Right.
even though you graduated. But their prime contractor kicked them off the project because they had graduated, and they're saying, no, the state law says we can stay in. And they didn't have anywhere to go to sort of deal with that. That's the kind of thing that they could then go to the ombudsman and say, wait, I'm being treated unfairly. Can you help me? And theoretically, based on what we're putting in the bill, that would be available to them. Right now, because they don't have a contractual relationship with the state can't do anything for them. I've seen some legislation in the past, for instance, that if a subcontractor doesn't get paid, the state would pay them. Well, they can't do that. There's no contractual relationship to do that. But they have somewhere they can go.
Gotcha.
To ask the ombudsman for help to help resolve that issue.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And we're looking at emergency legislation, right, Mr. Chairman? Thank you.
I'm sorry?
I was
Senator
just talking about emergency legislation. It's okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, Senator King says she's got one very quick little
Quick
question.
thing. I'm just looking back to when we had a small consulting engineering business. It wasn't a minority business, but it was our little business. And I think the hardest thing that small businesses have is collecting money for the jobs that they do. And I would call the people that had contracted with us, and they'd say, well, how much do you want? Well, I would want the full amount. But, and that's really pretty much what it was. And then we would go and file in small claims court, and they would wait until the hour before their claim came up, and then they'd pay. Very time-consuming, very hard to have a small business and do that. But that, I think, is the biggest problem that a small business has in the contracting process.
No, absolutely, and that's why we have the recommendation to extend that authority for the state to withhold payment to the prime contractor if they're not paying their subs, to all contracts. Right now, it just applies to construction contracts. But, we think that authority should extend to and that one they do use. They will withhold payments if somebody's not getting paid. But the other things, they don't use very much.
Very good. Great presentation. Thank you, gentlemen. Great questions from the committee. Thank you all. We're going to move on to the public hearing.
And as Mike said, we do have hard copies if anybody wants them.
Very good.
Thank you.
You have what? We have to stop for 5 minutes, okay? Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.